Detroit's financial emergency ends. A new crime-fighting tool, making all lives matter, and the debate over term limits. Stay put. MiWeek starts right now.
Recently, Michigan's economy has begun to turn around. Michigan's gained over 250,000 new jobs. We've paid off $20 billion in long-term debt. And our population is increasing for the first time in a decade. But to make Michigan a top 10 state, there's still plenty of work to be done. Step up and help put Michigan on top. Learn what you can do at MichiganTurnaroundPlan.com.
Funding is also provided by Delta.
Hi, and welcome to MiWeek. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Christy McDonald. A huge milestone for Detroit this week. The city's financial emergency is officially over. After 17 months, Detroit has exited from bankruptcy, and the emergency manager, Kevin Orr, has exited Detroit. Has a stronger city emerged? Also coming up, Detroit police hope a new mobile app will get residents more engaged in the fight against crime. Also, is the use of deadly force by police ever warranted? The thin line between law and order and civil liberties. And should we do away with term limits to reduce the number of lame ducks in the legislature? That is all coming up for you on MiWeek. But we do begin with the end of an historic chapter for Detroit. It is a new day in the city. $7 billion in debt has been wiped clean, and the focus has turned to rebuilding Detroit. Governor Snyder announced the end of the city's financial emergency at a press conference.
It's truly historic. And it really happened because of great partnerships, of people working together, and that's the biggest message of all of this. This has been an extremely difficult and hard process for many people, but people work together, and I think we've got an outstanding outcome, far better than people's expectation. And now, most importantly, we have the city poised for a new chapter that's about the growth of the city of Detroit after decades of decline, and that's extremely exciting.
This is a good day for the city. It was a necessary day. I do want to thank Judge Rhodes and the mediators for what was a record process in moving through the bankruptcy proceedings and allowing us to get back to business.
The governor accepted emergency manager Kevin Orr's resignation, thanked him for his service. MiWeek contributor Stephen Henderson recently sat down with Orr and spoke with him about Detroit's future.
If you look at the plan of adjustment and the projections over the next 5 to 10 years, the side that concerns everybody is revenue.
Sure.
It's not projected to grow.
It's flat.
Continuing to dwindle a little bit for the next couple of years, and then it's expected to sort of bottom out. How does the city adjust for that? They are spending now a lot of money gearing up to attack some of the problems that we see in the neighborhoods, increase services. Can we afford that?
Well, yeah, we can, because you remember last year the city's fixed costs, 40% were for legacy costs. That is,
that's right.
$400 million a year were going out the window to pay for debt service and for retiree health care. We've walled the city off from retiree health care obligation, which is going to be as much as $600 million by year 2023. Legacy costs are going to be 73%. So you redirect what revenue you do have to focus on city services, adequacy of services. And the city, as long as, even if it holds constant, we hope that revenue collection gets better. There's a plan in place, for instance, to have the state assist us with collecting revenue, tax collection, both for individuals and for corporations, move on. So maybe you get a little uptick in the out years, but we've tried to keep it conservative, relatively speaking, but hoping that if we relieve the city of its legacy costs and debt service, that money's now free up to make some of the commitments. So I'm comfortable that our projections can be well served for the city.
And you will be able to see that entire interview with Kevin Orr on American Black Journal here on Detroit Public Television, Sunday, December 28th. Well, now it is time to move forward for Detroit. The governor stressed it will take everyone working together. And we start our discussion there with our MiWeek contributors, Nolan Finley of the Detroit News and Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. Gentlemen, it's good to see you, especially on a historic occasion where I can say that we are finally done with the bankruptcy process in the city of Detroit, which is exciting news. It's interesting, though, and Kevin Orr on his way out of town was saying we must never forget, though. Never get complacent.
And that's the key, I think. You know, working together is fine, and we need collaboration, cooperation, what have you. But what we need more than anything else is fiscal discipline. Over the next decade or 2 decades, every dime that gets spent has to be worried over and studied over. No frivolous spending, no unnecessary bonding. Got rid of $7 billion in debt first day, borrowed another $1.2 billion to pay off creditors and what have you. It was a necessary bond issue, but the city can't look at its balance sheet and say, we got a whole lot of room here to add more debt, or they're going to be in the same place. They've got to really commit to good conservative fiscal principles.
And the reminder, though, that Detroit is not free and clear. You know, there's now this Financial Review Commission that will be there for the next 13 years. So while Mayor Duggan is in charge and moving forward, there's still that oversight.
Well, there's a lot of constraint, not just the board, but also the city's revenue projections. I mean, there's not enough money to do the things that we all know need to be done, particularly in Detroit's neighborhoods, which is where the focus has to turn now. I mean, downtown and midtown are doing really well. They're moving forward. The neighborhoods have lagged behind, and everybody seems to agree that we've got to do something there with economic opportunity, with blight control and public safety. There's not enough money to do these things, and so we have to start really thinking about ways Detroit can get more cash. And I don't know what those are, but you know, the state's going to have to be involved. Other communities are going to have to support it, because there's just not enough being generated.
Yeah, what are those ways that they can get more cash?
There's only one way, and that's growth. I mean, we've got to get more businesses in here. I think the new Midtown Arena project will bring in a ton of new businesses, new taxpayers, but we've got to have growth. You've got to take what's happening downtown, spread it into the neighborhoods. You can't have that level of deterioration and need out there. The tax base isn't big enough to support it. You have to have a growing city.
But what's the time projection on this then, Stephen?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about growth, you are talking about a long-term proposition. The city is still losing population net loss, even though we are attracting new residents at a quicker pace than we have in the past. There's still more people moving out. Those new residents are going to pay higher taxes than the people who are leaving, but you're not talking about growing the tax base here anytime in the next, I think, 5 to 10 years, Steve, in any real way.
One thing you can do is rationalize assessments so more people pay their tax bills.
Yes.
You only have 50% of the people in Detroit, or the property owners in Detroit, paying their taxes, and a lot of people say, well, I can't pay this tax bill. You've got my house assessed at 5 times what it's worth. If you rationalize assessments, bring the tax bill down to a point where people can actually pay their bill and feel okay about paying their bill, that it is fair, I think you can bring a lot of revenue that you're missing now just from people who aren't paying their bills.
I want to talk a little bit about Kevin Orr and the fact that now he's left town, and we don't know what the next chapter holds for him, and I'm sure he could pretty much write his ticket on anything that he wants to do right about now, because when he started this, he said this was the Olympics of restructuring, and I think it's fair to say that he got a gold medal. Both of you have spoken with him in the last couple of days. What struck you about him in these last days in the city emergence, and in his demeanor and what his thoughts have been?
Well, I think you know, he came across as a guy who knew he got the job done. I mean, there was a self-satisfaction there. I asked him, what didn't you get done that you wanted to do when this process started? And he basically couldn't come up with anything. He was surprised himself, I believe, at where the city was able to get to in a 17, 18-month time frame. I think he was pleased with himself, and he ought to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think he did a remarkable job of handling the tasks that he had, and you know, I think we also should acknowledge this was not an easy job to endure. Kevin Orr took a lot of flack from a lot of people in this community for what he was doing and for playing the role that he did. And I think he carried that off with a good deal of dignity. I think at times he said and did things that maybe I wouldn't have done that might have made things easier for him if he'd avoided them. But overall, I mean, this is a guy who came into this community as an outsider, which is hard enough as it is, as an outsider assigned to take control. And he weathered that in a pretty remarkable way and got the job done in record time. I mean, there's no precedent for this in municipal bankruptcy.
And you know, he may be the smartest person who ever walked through City Hall in Detroit. I mean, he really brought a brilliance to the job, come from a very successful private sector career. This was not your typical politician coming through trying to solve these problems. This was an expert.
I think it was really interesting in some of the interviews he's given over the last couple of days. He said the one person that he could count on during this whole process and it was Governor Snyder. Interesting what that relationship was between the two of them.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people misunderstand that relationship. I mean, Kevin Orr is a Democrat, and when I say he's a Democrat, I'm not just saying he's a guy who believes in the Democratic Party and votes that way. This is a guy who was a poll worker in Ohio, the legal counsel for the Obama campaign, the last two elections in Ohio. I mean, a very prominent Democrat who gets along with and saw eye to eye with Governor Snyder on this task. And he's right. That was the most consistent support that he had for the job that he was doing. And I think that says a lot, not just about the governor, it says a lot about Detroit, it says a lot about Kevin Orr in terms of sort of where we are, that our greatest advocate over the last 13, 14 months has been this pair, this.
Well, they're both businessmen. I mean, and they speak the same language, and they understand balance sheets, they understand expenditures and what you can do and what you can't do, and they were both in that way very practical, business-oriented people, regardless of their political stripes. I think they were a well-matched pair.
Yeah, and there's no question that in the recent election, where you saw a small uptick in the Detroit support for the governor, small in number but in percentage, pretty significant. I don't think there's any question that comes from the commitment that he's shown to doing something about Detroit. People may not agree entirely with what was done, but they do respect the fact that he said, I'm gonna stop the decline. I'm gonna draw a line in the sand, and we are going forward from here.
Well, part of Detroit's future growth and recovery really depends on how safe residents feel in the city, and that's another part of this puzzle as we talk about moving forward after bankruptcy. The Detroit Police Department has rolled out a new mobile app this week to help fight crime. It's called DPD Connect, and residents can get crime updates, they can look at wanted posters, and they can make anonymous incident reports. Now, at the same time, discussions are underway about equipping officers with tasers and body cameras. Are these viable solutions to fighting crime in the city? And I think when you do talk about the city moving forward, we've talked about education being a crucial piece in Detroit's success in the future, but also crime fighting. So Noah, let me start with you. In some of these discussions, when you see Detroit coming into the technological age of a mobile app like this, does this spur residents in communication more with the police department?
I think if any way that the police department can be more responsive to the community and that people can believe that they are protected, they are safe, and that somebody is out there who has their back, I think it'll help stabilize the population and make people feel better about living in the neighborhoods.
Is this good tools?
I think there's no question that's one of the biggest disincentives to being in Detroit at all, is that people don't necessarily feel safe, and we've got to have a turnaround there. But again, the question is, where's the money going to come from for all of this stuff? I mean, I think there's a real fear, and you can hear that from Mayor Duggan right now, who's looking at the books that he's going to be left with. How do you do this with not that much more money? If you put all of the money, the extra money we have into public safety, you still would not be solving our problem.
Can't do it with borrowing, and if they get to that temptation where, well, we're going to bond this out to pay for this, there's so many needs, and there's going to be huge temptation to go to the bond market. And I think that's why the state oversight to keep that impulse in check is so important.
But we talk about, when you talk about pulling out a mobile app, and maybe that's not going to take the largest part of your budget, but again, just a larger picture of making sure that that community feels like that they're in touch with what the police department is doing, and that the police department is responsive to them at least.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great idea, as are body cameras. I mean, this is something that we ran an op-ed this week from Marty Nolenberg, a Republican in the legislature, who's saying, look, you got to have this basic sort of monitoring tool on our police. But again, these are great ideas, but I am really worried about how we afford these things, and how the city does not get itself back into financial trouble by trying to do the things that it needs to do.
And the reality is the state's going to have to stay involved here. I mean, the state's going to have to keep helping. Federal government, which didn't do a whole lot during this bankruptcy in terms of actual cash assistance needs to step up and recognize we got a major city here that is struggling to come back to the point where it can support itself. And the foundation and corporate community were so generous during the grand bargain have to recognize that Detroit's a long-term project. It has a lot of need.
I would think the well would run dry after a while in terms of, I mean.
Can't.
Well, I mean, if you think about some of the things that, the point about the federal government is very good. For a while, you saw the federal government committing resources to Detroit to help sort out the grant process, which has been a mess for years, and we send lots of money back to Washington or don't claim as much as we should. We're still nowhere with all that stuff. That stuff has not been resolved in the way that it should. You still need the federal government to commit to helping us get the money that we just are entitled to out of Washington, never mind more.
Bringing it back a little bit to the police department and body cameras, and the federal government is talking about maybe helping subsidize in police departments around the country. Is this the proper tool that we need?
Well, I think it's a tool. I mean, it's certainly something that will document encounters and make everyone feel just a little more aware that they're being watched. I think that, overall, it's not about technology. It's not about new pieces of equipment or weapons or what have you. I mean, you have to establish trust between the people and the police department. I think James Craig is doing a good job, and I think that sort of 10-year consent decree we were under did a good job in Detroit of establishing ties between the community and the police, so that when things like this happen, there's not an immediate adversarial relationship.
And that does take time, and really the relationship between police and the community and the use of deadly force continues to dominate the national conversation. Recently, Stephen wrote about the death of Eric Garner in New York, the need for police to value all lives all the time. Stephen, I am always curious when you write something like that, what kind of response have you been getting?
Stay out of the comments, right? That's
no, wait a minute.
Advice.
Do you read the comment section or no?
I actually do read the comments. I read the comments on every column that I write and everything that we publish on the editorial page, because I feel like that's my job. I don't always respond, and I think we've reached a point where discourse, digital discourse, I think has reached a level of antipathy and viciousness that I think doesn't warrant always a decent response. But I do try to respond to the people who are actually trying to engage in a discussion or asking questions, legitimate questions about something that I've said. But that column got hundreds of comments, and a lot of them were not, I think, appropriate for the level of discourse that we are trying to establish.
I think it's interesting that you say that, because years ago, when people could finally no longer hide behind an anonymous login, you changed it so it had to be with the Facebook. So you had to have a name and an identity to involve yourself into these conversations. Nolan, are you finding the same thing? I think this is very interesting.
We thought that sort of removing the veil of anonymity would create a more civil discourse on our website and on our comments. Just the opposite's true. Facebook, it may be the foulest place you can have a conversation. People are just completely lost any courtesy, civility, politeness. You have a whole lot of people on Facebook just feel free to behave like jerks.
Yeah, and I think the shame of it is, I always say, it is a minority, right? If you look at how many page views that column got, or how many recommends it got on Facebook, it grossly outnumbers the negative or awful comments. But the comments are what sort of stand out. I mean, they're there, and we don't delete things that are not. That don't have expletives and things. I think people should be able to express themselves even when they're making themselves look awful.
I mean, here's how it usually plays out. The first 2 or 3 columns or comments, oh, I love what you wrote. The next, oh, you're an idiot, I hate what you wrote. And then they start fighting with each other. And about 12, 14 columns in, it's not about you anymore at all. They're calling each other names. You don't even know what.
And then there's usually a login saying, I can make $12,000 a month at home for this job. But let me get back to your column real quick before we leave this topic of conversation. Do you find that more people are engaging in the conversation about excessive force, and if excessive force from police is ever warranted in a situation?
Well, I mean, I think everyone's attention is on it. When I talked to Kevin Orr last week, for his exit interview for American Black Journal. After the interview was over, he and I sat and talked for about 20 minutes about the attention that he and I have on our children, middle-class kids, African-American kids growing up in the United States, supposedly in an environment where they should be past the point where race matters, and of course they're not. And the fear that is sort of welling up in middle-class African-Americans about that. I was really moved by the idea that Kevin Orr, who I think is sort of the prototype of black economic success in this country, is as concerned as somebody who lives in a bad neighborhood in Detroit about this problem. And so yeah, it's becoming universal. More and more people are paying attention. More and more people feel like they need to be involved. And I think that's how we'll get to some of the practical solutions that need to be.
But look at the different reaction to Garner compared to Brown and Ferguson. The difference was it was on videotape. You knew exactly what happened. Yeah. And you have almost universal condemnation of what happened on Staten Island, and still a lot of confusion about what happened in Ferguson.
Which also brings the question of body cameras and the integrity of those as well. All right, and turning now to Lansing, legislators continue to debate over how to get the money to fix the state's roads. The conference committee, well, they're supposed to tackle the issue, and work continues on a bill to expand the 6% sales tax to certain services. So far, no agreement, but the clock is ticking on the lame duck session that ends next week. So if you're irritated with all this last-minute lame duck activity in Lansing, maybe we should be looking at what influences all of the on the way out the door deal making. Term limits. Nolan wrote this week, it is time to get rid of them. Nolan?
Beyond time. I never supported term limits. I thought it's an affront to democracy. You're trying to protect people from themselves. You should have a right to vote for whomever you want. If your representative is serving you well, keep electing him or her. But term limits has left us with an amateurish legislature, particularly in the leadership positions. Just about the time they learn their jobs, they're out the door. I think everybody would agree that Richardville and Bolger are a lot better leaders than they were, say, 2 years ago. Even they're getting control of their caucus, and now they're gone, and new folks. So we're going to have to get to know. They're going to have to get to know their job. It's just been a disaster. But I think the only hope of getting rid of them is to swap them from a part-time legislature, and I believe Michigan can get by with a part-time legislature.
Ooh, part-time legislature. Do you think that's going to have some traction?
Well, you do see those two issues sort of paired a lot.
Right.
Okay, we'd give up term limits if they weren't around all the time. I think they're independent ideas, and I think it's important to sort of evaluate each independently. Term limits are an awful idea. They have not done anything that we thought they would do, and they've done a lot of things that have made government much worse in Michigan. Our legislature is much less productive in terms of dealing with upfront, big picture issues than it was before term limits. I think there's no question about that. Whether we have a part-time legislature is a separate question, and I don't have a problem with part-time legislature. I lived in Maryland and Kentucky, both states that have part-time legislators. They work just fine. I get nervous when we try to tie-bar things that don't really have to do with each other and say, well, this is the only way to do it. Randy Richardville introduced a bill this week to at least expand the scope of term limits. I think that's the beginning of a conversation that we can have about redoing that.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks, gentlemen. It's always good to see you, and that is going to do it for MiWeek. Thanks so much for joining us. Make sure you find us at MiWeek.org and on Facebook and Twitter. We are there during the week. I'm Christy McDonald. For all of us at Detroit Public TV, we will see you next week. Take care.